Let's come over to some of the things which you discuss on your channel a bit more, which is the Zodiac Killer and also Jack the Ripper. Is is there quite a lot? Is the community amongst those true crimes much larger than you expected it to be?
Okay, so I really thought that there would be a much bigger response to the Jack the Ripper episodes that I had been putting out because, I mean, it's a very popular story and it's a very widely discussed story, but that almost worked as a disadvantage because there already is a lot of amount of Jack the Ripper videos on YouTube and a lot of other theorists and a lot of higher end, very polished channels that talk about Jack the Ripper very regularly. And that hasn't really morphed into something bigger. And also, I have very little interaction with other Jack the Ripper theorists or Ripperologists, if we want to call them that. I mean, you were asking about the Zodiac sleuths. Yes, I've talked to countless Zodiac researchers, zodiologists, all up and down the spectrum. When it comes to Jack the Ripper, I'm still somewhat of a newcomer to that mystery. And I have had very limited interactions with other people. Maybe I get an email here and there from somebody in the comment section. Oh, well, here's an idea for a future episode, and of course I love that. But those are fans of the show as opposed to someone who has a book out on the subject or doing their own podcast. But I mean, that could happen in the future, and I mean, why not?
What do you think's the most credible theory about the Zodiac Killer that you've heard to date in regards to, I guess, motive and also as well with regards to suspect and combining the two, suspect and motivation?
Back in 2021, I was discussing this with Richard Grinnell, as previously stated, the moderator of ZodiacCiphers.com, and he said that he gave all the suspects a 0 out of 10. And I was thinking about my own experience looking into the Zodiac killer mystery, and there are all of these people who have been accused of being the Zodiac. And the more time that I spent looking at them, I found problems with all of them. Like, there's just this reason why this person shouldn't be the Zodiac, or there's insufficient evidence, or if someone has a case that they built, a lot of it's circumstantial. And I really began to think more in terms of what you said about motive, like what would drive this person to become a serial killer. And the Zodiac wasn't only a serial killer. Of course, he wrote letters, he wrote cryptograms, little puzzles that he's trying to get people to solve. And that's where I began to think more about this. And the explanations for the motive in the Zodiac murders that I've examined are perhaps not the most entertaining thing that people would want to hear. I think a lot of it was sexual frustration. I think that a lot of it was someone who felt that he was rejected from society, probably a bad relationship with his mother or both parents. I mentioned recently that I appeared on Citizen Detective with Mike Morford, and one of the other co hosts of that program is Dr. Lee Meller, who made a very good statement about the Phantom Killer, another serial killer who operated in America in 1946. And he said that it's almost as if he was trying to kill the male victims so he could have access to the female victims, or disable the male victims, incapacitate the male victims in some way so he could have access to the female victims. And just possibly, some way, somehow, this could be the result of having a very overbearing father, a very controlling father, and a very cruel mother, so to speak. I mean, that gets into a little bit of the world of Freudian psychology, but I think that those elements are present in the Zodiac killer's actions and his choices, and also egoism. Wrote this out once when they said, I wish we could see the human ego measured, or somebody's like self-image of themselves measured, like as they would walk by, because we would have seen a massive increase in the Zodiac killer's self-image of himself. And you, after he committed the crimes and started writing the letters, ah ha ha, I committed a crime spree and nobody ever figured it out. People would have then been able to identify this person. The Zodiac killer was very egotistical, conceited, full of himself, but at the same time also very lonely and sad. And he even said this in his letters, I get so lonely that I could do my thing, meaning that he commit murders. He's openly admitting that one of the reasons why he's committing the murders is loneliness. And there are these different voices in the Zodiac killer letters, and those are two of them that I've talked about, where part of it is just like, I'm smarter than you, I'm more clever than you are. Zodiac's own words. I think he actually said more clever or maybe something similar to that nature. And then you have this person who's just sad and has no friends and nothing else to do. So I'm just seeing someone who is somewhat rejected from society who had some very, very major parental issues.
Yeah, and that's something that I think Mike Rodelli does bring up in his book when he was talking about the facets of personality. You have your public personality, you have your personality of how you are in private, and then you've got the personality, of course, that nobody ever sees. And he obviously uses that to allude to his suspect, Shel Kuvali, who I don't think is the Zodiac killer, was the Zodiac killer for many different reasons, perhaps most because I don't think he had the motive to do it. And all of the things which you just discussed as well were well outside of the radar in terms of, those things. And even if he did have some of those things, I think he was just really engaged in other activities that I think he was actually just too busy to be the Zodiac killer, to be perfectly honest. But what Mike does bring up quite well is that final point of the personality that nobody else sees, that we all have inside of us to some extent. And I think the profiling around that would be very interesting. If you picked out, for example, all of the people that fitted the Zodiac killer appearance, 5'8" to 6 feet tall, 200 to 240 pounds, heavy build. If you started profiling all of those people, I think, I guess if you had enough time and money and access to resources, eventually you probably would be able to narrow it down to about, 50 to 100 people, and then you just work your way through them. But obviously that's much easier said than done, particularly back in a time when, you could be relatively anonymous, even in the United States.
Oh yes, absolutely. I mean, when it comes to Mike Rodelli's suspect, his name was Shel Cavalli, as you said. He was a businessman. He worked with automobiles, and that was his trade. Although when I was reading the book Lunches with Mr. Q by Kevin Nelson, that's written about him, he also had a brief venture into banking, which wasn't as successful. But he also had a failure in his life, though, when he tried to launch the Cavalli Motors, himself having his own type of car. And I mean, he's just an incredible person. I mean, he's the type of person they should be studying in business classes. He had his own 12 rules for life about, like, business principles. And he also was just a very, very domineering, go, go, go type of businessman. Not to mention that he was a speed junkie, just completely obsessed with horse racing and boat racing and, of course, auto racing. So, as you said, he had so much in his life outside of the Zodiac mystery, and that he's just going to be like, all right, well, I've already done everything else. Now I'm going to live this double life of being a serial killer as the ultimate thrill kill. I don't really find that too convincing either.
Yeah, I think one of the motivating factors for the Zodiac was creating a caricature that, police would attach themselves to in terms of determining the motivation behind a lot of his actions. So you look at, um, a lot of the things that he says, how he conducts himself, and even just so much as the name. Like a lot of the stuff is actually just pulled from comic books and cartoons. Like, you're talking about Lady Fortune, The Wheel of Death. You're talking Charlie Chan and Treasure Island. All of those things, it just seems like he's just sort of plucked bits and pieces and assembled this kind of caricature personality, really, um, as kind of like the front man to be the sort of this criminal, and then sort of deep down, it's kind of just like those underlying factors that you were talking about earlier on, that he's using that caricature as a cover for, to hide a lot of that. And when they do find the Zodiac killer one day, because I feel like it probably will be solved, if not within our lifetime, then definitely within the lifetime after that. I think you probably will discover that he is definitely someone who is kind of like DB Cooper, you know, there never quite reaches his potential, never quite gets to that level where he wants to go in life, and feels like society has held him back, and therefore feels like it is within his own rights to go and commit those crimes. But I'm interested as well because I sent in a comment to you, I think via Buy Me a Coffee, which was talking about that lady's trip to Lake Berryessa with her mum, which gave me the real heebie-jeebies when I first read it because I read it late at night and obviously it was pitch black outside. I was like,
Yeah.
"Holy moly! Like this is quite a story." Do you get a lot of stories like that coming into the show, like sort of via the correspondences you have with people, and how do you filter them out, like and sort of trying to assess the credibility of what comes in?
Well, absolutely. I do get a lot of ideas that have been shared into the show. Some of them come via buymeacoffee.com, as you just said. And I filter them out in a way as it actually goes back to a show called Dragon's Den from the UK, which is very similar to Shark Tank in America, where it's like a business competition show where people have to present their business idea to a panel of successful people, multimillionaires sometimes. And in the first episode of Dragon's Den, some one of the panelists said, she's a multimillionaire, and she's saying, "My first rule is if I don't like somebody, I'm not working with them." And that's how I started out because if I felt that someone was being extremely rude and they were like some guy who just wrote me once and just said like, "I want you to do an off the air interview with me first, then I want you to bring me on as a guest, and then we're going to talk about this." I'm like, "Whoa, whoa, I haven't agreed to anything yet." I mean, just being so pushy. And I also didn't find that his material had an enormous amount of credibility. So yeah, I pushed that material aside because I didn't think that he was speaking the truth, and I also didn't like how he was acting toward me. So it's just like all of the boxes get marked out in terms of no, I don't want this person or his ideas on my show. And he's welcome to post anywhere else online. It's not like he has been completely banned or canceled, so to speak. But that's mostly the filtering process. It's purely a case by case basis. But with that being said, frequently I do talk about theories that I disagree with. Because, I mean, maybe there can be an element of curiosity, or also, if you disagree with somebody's theory, then you can challenge it on the merits. Okay, I think this person is wrong for this reason, for that reason, for this reason, for that reason. But I mean, it's purely a case by case basis.
Yeah, and that also, I guess, ties across into my next question, which is in regards to the eyewitness testimony in regards to the Zodiac killer, because there's so much variation, height, weight, um, build, even build. They say heavy set, but like that varies from 200 to 250 pounds, which is an enormous discrepancy. I mean, if you looked at someone that's 200 pounds, 6 foot tall versus 250, I mean, that 250 pound person is going to be quite a bit bigger. Is is that something that you feel has stalled the investigation into the case? Is the differing eyewitness testimony? Because you look at how Brian Hart now describes the Zodiac killer versus the Paul Stein murder sketch from the Robbins kids. I feel like that sketch really needs an updating to heavy set because what we see now is someone that's about 180 pounds in that picture.
Absolutely, I think that it's held things back in terms of internet sleuthing and the online communities and the forums and the message boards. I absolutely think the height and weight discrepancies have done more harm than good because, as you just said, there are multiple sightings of a perpetrator in the Zodiac killer mystery who is estimated to have been 5 feet 8 inches tall after the Blue Rock Springs shooting, the second crime, and after the Stein murder, the fourth crime. And there is also a possible Zodiac estimation of being 6 feet tall at Lake Berryessa, which comes to us from Cecilia Shepard, the victim who passed away in the hospital. But before she died, she was able to estimate that, or I want to be a little bit clearer. She said that he was about 2 inches taller than a 5'10" man. I mean, to give the nutshell version, so that would be 6 feet tall. So 5 feet 8 to 6 feet tall, that's a very wide range when it comes to adult males. And you also brought up something very important. People are terrible at judging height. The first time that I met my sister's boyfriend, I thought he was shorter than me. Then the next time I stood next to him, I'm like, oh, he's taller than me. And the reason why was like, when I met him, he was sitting down, and then when he stood up, he was not as tall as I thought he was. And then, like, I guess that registered in my mind that he was shorter than I was, but he's actually taller than me. People are bad at judging height, and especially with something like the Stein murder, where you have the Robbins kids who went on to provide the details that are used in the famous Zodiac killer composite sketches, looking at the Zodiac from a window. I mean, from a substantial distance. You also have the sighting from Mike Mageau after the Blue Rock Springs shooting, who wasn't able to make out any discernible features because he was blinded by a flashlight. He only said that he saw the person in profile and that he estimated that he was 5 feet 8 inches tall. But he did say one thing on the shorter side. I mean, he could be completely mistaken. As I said, I was mistaken about standing next to somebody, and I thought he was shorter than I was, but he's actually taller than me.
Mm.
So Mike Peugeot was also shot multiple times. He had one bullet that even went through his face, through his tongue and jaw. Sounds horribly painful. And he wasn't trying to remember the details of the killer. So this has just created all types of doubt and confusion. And some people use it to their advantage when they're just going to be saying, oh, my daddy was the Zodiac killer. And he is well, it doesn't matter who he is because there's always an explanation. I mean, 5 feet 8 inches tall to 6 feet tall, that's a very big range.
Yeah, that's very true. And it also is the same thing with people's assumptions. And, we can only make assumptions because there's still unsolved cases. It's still an unsolved case as we are recording right now, where the Zodiac went after all of these crimes. Because that's something that actually intrigues me, I think, quite significantly is, did he go home and then immediately write the letters afterwards? What was his thinking? What sort of ego level did he have? Talking about what we discussed earlier on. And I honestly think that with the Lake Herman Road, just from what you said, I feel like it was such an adrenaline rush if it was his first crime. I don't even feel like he was capable of doing anything else but just either sitting in his car shaking with excitement, or going home and just sitting on the couch, and that's it. Because it's like the same thing with, if you have such a huge surge of excitement, through a big achievement in your life, I think people can relate to the feeling like you actually feel incapable of doing anything else in said moment. And then once he went on to commit the crimes at Blue Rock Springs, on the 4th of July or 5th of July, whenever it did happen, you find that, he felt a little bit more confident and a little bit more calm and composed to be able to go and, call the police and taunt them with Nancy Slover, and then with Lake Berryessa, going and writing on the car door. And as Richard Grinnell said quite rightly, probably walking back to his car like half a mile, because you look at that missing time, which needs to be accounted for, from the time he commits the crimes to driving to the phone booth out in Napa. You see that there's quite a discrepancy. And I think that that sighting of Dr. Rayfield's son, I believe it was, seeing a man walking up, heavy build, wearing a shirt with red in it, I think is like a dead ringer that, yep, he probably did see the Zodiac killer that day. He just didn't know it. And then obviously with Paul Stein, you've got a man that walks right past the police, and, what are the chances? There was either, you know, Shal Cavalli, it was either the Zodiac killer, or it was just one and the same.
Oh yes, yes, and there are these different reports and like discrepancies about the way that people look. As far as the dentist and his son who saw the person, there's a very high chance that was the Zodiac. I mean, very possibly be. But you touched on something that was important as well. There are large gaps of time after the murders and when the Zodiac called in. Not saying this is the Zodiac speaking. Have you noticed that before? The Zodiac would write in his letters and he would say, "This is the Zodiac speaking," but he made phone calls and he didn't say that. He just said, "If you go 1 mile east on the Columbus Parkway, you'll find kids in a car. I killed them." I'm paraphrasing, but he's not actually using that when he had the opportunity to do so verbally. After the Blue Rock Springs shooting on July 4th of 1969, there is approximately 38 minutes before the call. I mean, we don't know when the shooting really occurred. Was it 11:55, 11:57 p.m., or as you pointed out, it could be July 5th, maybe 12:01, 12:02 a.m. But then the murders were reported at 12:10 a.m. by the people who had found Mike Michaud and Darlene Ferrin. At 12:38 a.m., Darlene Ferrin was pronounced dead in the hospital. At 12:40 a.m., there's a phone call that comes in where somebody is taking credit for both the Blue Rock Springs shooting and the Lake Herman Road murders, saying, "I also killed those kids last year." And then 3 weeks later, we had a letter when it was completely identified and completely certified that that person was indeed taking credit for the Lake Herman Road murders when he said, I am the murderer of the two teenagers last Christmas at Lake Herman and the girl on the 4th of July. And that begins the birth of the Zodiac Killer persona in the letters. And the Zodiac also attached three parts of a cryptogram or cipher that were mailed to three different newspapers: the San Francisco Chronicle, the San Francisco Examiner, and the Vallejo Times Herald. And also now we have the Zodiac ciphers. It's the foundation of this persona that is coming into play and coming into existence. Terrible, terrible stuff. I mean, this guy murdered people and he was just playing games. No matter what theory anybody has, multiple killers theory, hoax theory, it's all terrible. But that is what happened.
Yeah, it's so intriguing to see that, I guess, the difference between who the Zodiac actually was when he was committing the crimes versus who he was in the letters. I feel like in the letters it kind of gave him more power to be creative about the sort of personality he could construct into people's minds about who he was. When, if you look at the crimes that he committed, it could have been a very real possibility that he could have been caught in the act at Lake Herman Road, at the first crime with someone driving by, you know, completely unaware as to what's going on. With Blue Rock Springs as well, there's also the um, the period where there was a police officer there. Was it 10, 15 minutes before the crime happened?
Yeah, thereabouts, Officer Richard Hoffman was patrolling the park shortly before the crime took place.
Yeah, and then also as well at the Presidio Heights one, where I mean, people say that the biggest mistake what that night was Donald Falk, um, not stopping to talk to the Zodiac, apparently, even though I feel like he probably did. But I feel like the biggest mistake, looking at the eyewitness testimony and reports, is the fact that Palisetti and Pater didn't just floor it and just go and try and find the Zodiac and just leave the kids there.
I mean, that definitely could have changed some things. Now, this issue, though, about Donald Falk talking to the Zodiac, I'm going to explore this more on Zodiac Monday in the near future. But for the longest time, I thought that he didn't do it, that he maybe saw this person walking by, but they were given the false information that they needed to look for a black man, which was put out on the police all points bulletin, that they're supposed to be looking for this black male adult, when in reality it was a white male adult. That's the famous story that everybody knows. But from listening to everybody's different backgrounds and their take on the subject, one of the real benefits to doing an intermediary show like Black Box Online Radio is, okay, it sounds like this is what makes sense from him, this is what makes sense from her, and this is what makes sense from him. And the idea that I have right now is that, number one, yes, indeed, Donald Falk did talk to the Zodiac, and possibly Eric Zelms also talked to the Zodiac. And the reason why they didn't come forward sooner with their information is because they didn't want to lose face, in the sense that they let this serial killer slip right through their fingertips. Embarrassment as well. And it was discussed in an interview that was done with between Howard Davis and Eric Zelms' widow Diana, where she said that the story that she heard was that, more or less, Donald Falk shared the information in that way because he was trying to protect Eric Zelms. And again, this is coming from Zelms to his wife, which was then shared to Howard Davis. Okay, third hand, but it's done to protect somebody's reputation because a blunder occurred and it's trying to do damage control, so to speak. But that would mean that yes, there was an exchange between Falcon and the Zodiac, and the Zodiac pointed him in the wrong direction, and that was one of the ways that he was able to escape. But if they hadn't put out that all points bulletin to look for a black man, who knows what could have happened? They could have just arrested him right there.
How do you think the Zodiac got down to Mason and Geary?
You mean after he left the Presidio Heights crime scene?
No, like, in the lead up to it, like down to the theater district.
Oh, you mean like before, like when before he got into the taxi cab? I wish I knew. I mean, that's something that I haven't actually thought about before, because he is at, I always mess up the name of this restaurant. It's the Pinecrest Diner, and that's close to where he gets into the taxi cab. Some people have said that there was a performance of the Mikado that was playing nearby, and that he may have gone to a showing there. I really am not sure, because the Zodiac may have just been eating at the diner, or maybe he was just walking around. It really depends on whether Paul Stein was targeted as a specific victim and he's kind of following the guy, or it was just a random taxi cab um, murder, or just he wanted to murder a taxi driver for a particular reason, and we don't necessarily know why. I'm really not sure the lead up.
And a bit of speculation. How do you think he escaped after talking to Falk, if that's what happened?
I'm going to turn to Michael Cole, who wrote the Zodiac Revisited trilogy, and he said that we don't want to admit this, but bad people often tell the truth. I mean, sometimes they're liars, sometimes sociopaths make up weird stories to lie, but sometimes they tell the truth as well. And the Zodiac said that he went into the park, and they would have caught him if they had thoroughly searched the park. That's what I'm going with right now. But I did hear a very convincing explanation from someone named Dennis D, who follows the show, when he was proposing that the Zodiac was hiding in the alcoves of the Presidio Heights neighborhood, like the buildings, and that people are actually just walking up and down past him, and he's kind of just like a statue, and they're not looking in there. So there might be some merit to that as well.
Yeah, it's like, that crime and Lake Berryessa to me are the ones that are the most interesting because you feel like all it could have took is for like a park ranger or a police officer on duty to spot him doing that, and boom, it's all over. You never hear for any further leaders or correspondence because the guy's in cuffs and arrested, and that's the end of that. But I think if he had been arrested, I think especially with the Paul Stein one, I think it's very doubtful that he would have confessed to the other crimes unless he's got like a, sort of an astronomical ego, or he's absolutely, loopy in the head about going to jail or going to the gas chamber or whatever it is. Because you look at that cipher, the Z340, that was finally decoded after 51 years, where he was saying how he is not afraid of the gas chamber. And I would actually say that he probably is telling the truth in that one.
Yes, not afraid, but definitely you touched on something else though. The Zodiac wanted to return to normal life, the return to normalcy, as opposed to the spree killers or the mass shooters who want to commit the crime and possibly even die in the action. I mean, many mass shooters commit suicide shortly after their crime took place. And I was just reading Jeremy Berthione's book called So I See You Don't Paint Houses, which is about the Zodiac killer suspect Richard Gaikowski. And even aside from his suspect, Jeremy Berthiaume proposed that the Zodiac may have been inspired by the spree killers Charlie Starkweather and Carol Ann Fugate. And I mean, like, just looking at how not caring about society, not caring about the rules, and also something that's touched upon in their story, with the story of Charlie Starkweather most precisely, feeling that he was cheated out of his chance in life, feeling that he did not have the ability to succeed because of the way in which he was born. So he committed a crime spree and thinking, I don't care what happens to me. And the Zodiac could have used that as an influence. It was nationwide news. I mean, 1957, 58, particularly in 1958, as well as a host of movies have been made about it, including Badlands. But also, there is a point, though, where the Zodiac did not want to do that. He didn't want to go that far. He wanted to return to his normal life or a normal life. And with the sole exception of maybe the Zodiac committed suicide, and we don't know, it's an unsolved case, but I mean, there's insufficient evidence to support that.
What do you think his last letter was?
As of now, I have to say it's the 1974 Exorcist letter, the one that says, I saw and think The Exorcist was the best satirical comedy ever, signed yours truly. He plunged himself into the billowy wave, and an echo arose from the suicide's grave, Titwillow, 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 and it goes on for a little bit. But, I mean, that does say something about suicide. I mean, I said there's insufficient evidence to support the idea that the Zodiac committed suicide, but with that reference, he plunged himself into the billowy waves and an echo arose from the suicide's grave. That is a direct quotation from the Mikado by Gilbert and Sullivan, more or less. And a lot of people think that that was intending to put an end to the Zodiac killer's persona or the Zodiac's character. The Exorcist letter doesn't even begin with the famous line, This is the Zodiac speaking. It's almost as if this person was a serial killer. They committed a crime spree in the 1960s and 70s, mostly the 1960s. I mean, I haven't seen any convincing evidence the Zodiac killed anybody in the 1970s. I mean, 68, 69, sure. 70, all question marks. Then he's been writing letters. He has the general public's attention. He has the nation's attention, so to speak. In 1974, after roughly 2 years of silence, maybe 2.5 years of silence, he wants to put an end to the Zodiac persona, and he has moved on from that part of his life onto something else. That's just what I think. But as I'm not selling anything about the Zodiac killer, if it turns out tomorrow that there are a host of other letters that are authenticated, I will accept the result.
I've really had my thinking challenged by Richard Grinnell on that in regards to some of the letters that appeared, much later on. I don't know about the 2001 card, but you look at the killing of is it Charles Saline? To me, I feel like that one quite possibly might be the last one, just based on the demeanor, just on the way, there was a lot of ego behind the contents of that letter, and just also that taunting feeling as well. That, oh gosh, as if this ain't the Zodiac, then it sure as heck could very well be a double or a very good impersonator. Um, and I think why, like we've been sort of talking about the Zodiac case now, sort of for the better part of 25 minutes. I think why it's so interesting is because there's that sense of the unknown, but also the sense as well that, and this was something that was said on Crime TV here in New Zealand a while ago, is it's like, serial killers often intrigue us because they appear to be just like us. And they are. Like there's certain things that differentiate them, in a very big way in some cases, but in a lot of other ways, they're people with jobs, they're people that um, do interact with society, even if it's in a limited capacity. And people are trying to figure out, where was it that this person switched? And is it noticeable, or was it something that happened immediately or over a period of time? Like, what was the tipping point? And I think very often you can see a lot of those trends. And to give a big shout out to Black Box Online Radio, it's something that Ned unpacks really well in a lot of his episodes, not just with Zodiac Monday, but the Anything Goes and Ripper Wednesday. I highly recommend you check it out. And I'll say a massive thanks to Ned for joining us today.
All right, Stuart, thank you so much for having me on the program. And yes, of course, Black Box Online Radio, and of course, buymeacoffee.com/blackboxnid88. And that's the website that I've been using, as previously stated, for donations. But the reason why I'm sharing that with you now is I'm going to be launching the Black Box Online Radio membership very soon. That is going to have lots of bonus features and bonus content, including a short booklet that I've written called True Crime Teaches Us to Conquer Toxic People, which will be available through the membership, and that'll be distributed that way. And that's all through buymeacoffee.com/blackboxned88. And Stuart, thank you for having me.